where every clue hides a secret, and every secret has a story.
Elias tore open the parcel on his desk, and a shard of blue gleamed between water-stained pages. Curiosity prickled his fingers as he lifted the leather cover. That curiosity had driven him to dusty auctions and late nights cataloguing proofs for other men's reputations. The shard was small enough to fit beneath a thumbnail, its surface cold and granular. And inside the journal the first entry named an artefact that claimed it could show buried crimes. He read the line aloud, because saying a sentence steadied him. The sapphire will call up what the guilty buried. Curiosity, not glory, pushed him. He wanted only to clear the name of a scholar reduced to ridicule. The lamplight threw a circle on the desk, and outside a carriage rolled past. But inside Elias felt the room close to the journal's margin. He kept the lamp low while he turned pages. The paper smelled of damp glue and old iron filings. Helene's boots clicked in the corridor. She entered with a tray and froze at the doorway when she saw the open parcel. Elias, she asked, setting the tray down with a soft clack. Who sent this? Elias did not look up at first. He showed her the shard between 2 fingers from an estate lot in Leopoldstadt. He said a journal tied to Geranten clerk. It mentions a way to make a stone show scenes crimes. Names. He watched Helene's face for the reaction he feared. Her mouth tightened. Her hands folded around the tray clerk. Helene was a name people whispered badly. Why would you seek that? Helene had been with Elias long enough to know the cadence of his interest. She walked closer, her palms flat on the table, and touched the journal's edge, as if measuring its danger. Do not. She began, then stopped because Elias read another line aloud. Faster this time. Hold sapphire to pure flame, and speak the patron's name. The stone will show what hands have done. His voice held neither mockery nor certainty, only an insistence that was new. He had come to the journal for one clear reason: to restore Dra. Clerk's reputation in the university registers and, if possible, vindicate a man whom Elias believed the academy had abandoned. That stated purpose sat in his chest like a folded paper. The name attached to a recent crime galled him a patron well known in Vienna's polite circles. If the journal was true, revealing that patron would topple more than a reputation. It would bring Elias into the reach of people who could ruin him for poking where they preferred rot to stay hidden. Helene put the tray aside and crossed the small study in 2 steps. Elias Marwood, she said plainly, using his name like a bridle. You promised to be careful with purchases. You promised me that. Her voice was low but steady. She took the sapphire when he offered it, turning the stone in her palm. The blue caught the lamp like a wet eye. Ethos could be lies and trouble both. We do not need trouble. Elias, she kept saying his name as if to anchor him. He felt the tether of her steadiness pull at his resolve. He folded the journal open to the inket script. The hand was cramped and confident, letters pressed with a scholar's impatience. Elias read the next passage aloud, noticing the cadence, the small annotations in the margin written by a different, firmer hand. The margin smelled faintly of carbolic and crushed herb. Clerk had recorded regents, measurements, even snippets of case notes. The entry moved from experiment into an account that placed a named patron at a house where blood had been found 2 years earlier. The ink named a servant who had died within a week of that night. Helene's lips thinned. Name them. Elias, she said, steadying her hands on the back of a chair. Name the patron. If this is to do something, tell me who is tied to it. She wanted facts. She wanted to turn this into a known problem. Elias spoke the name softly, not to the stone, not yet, and Helene's eyes flicked to the curtained window, as if she expected someone outside to overhear Count Radek. He said Radek is in the entry. The words made Helene's posture shift. A faint, cold tension rose along her jaw. Doubt slid into Elias as he watched Helene fold the cloth napkin. He thought of the university lists where Radek's donations kept certain chairs afloat. He thought of how prestigious names had insulated wrongdoers before. The journal promised evidence, but the evidence required ritual and a tiny stone that might be a curio. He lifted the sapphire again. It left a damp crescent on his fingertip. Later, after Helene insisted he eat something, Elias returned to the desk and read until the script blurred. He found a detailed incantatory passage written in Clerk's voice, exact candle placement, the angle to hold the stone, the phrasing of a name. The lines shifted the narrative into first-person notes by Clerk as if the alchemist spoke through time. He annotated a memory of a lab night when the stone had thrown an image so clear he could write what he saw. For a brief, reckless minute Elias felt something like certainty. He folded the page and mimicked the exact candle arrangement described, 3 tapers in a triangular pool, the stone in the center on a scrap of hexagonal wax. Helene caught him arranging the candles and reached for the stone with the cloth. Elias, she said sharply, put it away. Please. The first tilt of argument rose with quick, practical line. Helene, I need only a glimpse. If a name is true, he began, a glimpse will bring enemies. Elias. She answered, a glimpse will bind your conscience to actions you cannot stop. Her voice tightened into a sequence of short sentences, each one a small stake planted between them. Elias held the stone between 2 fingers and closed his mouth. They argued for a short 10 minutes that read like a litany of Keresiu have not slept proper lately. Heleniu have become thinner at the shoulders. Elias, you read like a man with a fever. Elias pressed his thumb into the sapphire. It is not fever. It is work. If I can clear Clerk, I can put right what others broke. Helene's reply came in quick lines. If you bring this to the university, they will thank you and then bury the result. If you speak too loud, Count Radic will not thank you. If you expose him, Elias, what then? The exchange shifted his emotion again, from curiosity to a tight, anxious calculation. He set the stone on the wax and bent close, repeating the phrasing Clerk had used. The words felt awkward on his tongue, and he had to read the exact sequence 3 times before he could say them without tripping. As he spoke the last syllable, a motion ran up his arms, not a wind from the window, but a sensation in the bone. The lamplight steadied, and in the candle pool the sapphire threw a sheen like a tiny puddle reflecting a lamp from another room. The surface of the stone changed. Within its blue there was a deeper shape like a room photographed through rain. Elias blinked, and then the study itself seemed to recede from the edges of his sight. He did not think of that as a metaphor, but as a physical narrowing at his temples. The journal described the vision as if it were a filmed scene. Place the stone, call the name. Watch the memory of the stone in the vision. The edges of the frame were sharp. Elias saw a corridor with a runner soaked from tracking damp soil, a man's boot pressed into a puddle. He recognized the cut of a cuff and, in the next flash, a hand, not the firm's white hands of the academy, but a stained palm clenching a silk handkerchief at the moment someone fell. He started and dropped the stone. The shard pinged softly on the wax and rolled to Helene. Slipper, Elias, she said, leaning forward and seizing the sapphire as if it might jump into flame. Her breathing changed. She placed the stone gently on the tray and wrapped it in a scrap of linen. What did you see? She asked. Her voice was short. Each short question anchored the scene in action. Elias rubbed at his eyes with his wrist. He could not make the memory vanish by closing his lids. He remembered details from the vision with the clarity of a ledger entry, a room with wallpaper of tiny fleur-de-lis, a silver hairpin broken on the floor, a child's bonnet half under a chair. He remembered a man's voice saying, "You will not speak of this, do you hear?" And in the same instant the voice shifted into a different tone, an apology cut off by the sound of scuffling. The memory held a patron's laugh. He recognized it as a laugh he had heard at a university banquet years earlier. Helene's forehead creased. Name him, she said. Who laughed? Elias steadied himself. It sounded like Radic, he said, Count Radic's tone. He laughed once, and then he pressed the hand Helene's fingers tightened around the linen. Radic again, she muttered. Her breathing came quicker. The air in the study felt fuller of possible listeners. Doubt rose again, doubt that his mind had supplied details, doubt that a shard could show truth, and doubt about the cost of proving it. He pushed back from the desk and paced. The actions that followed were concrete. He fetched his pocket watch, wound it, listened to the soft tick. He opened a drawer and pulled out the university's old catalogues to cross-check the name of servants and patrons mentioned in clerk's notes. Each small physical thing steadied him from the grip of the visions after images. Helene watched him with the practical patience of someone who had seen men unravel before Elias. She said, "If this name's Radek and that servant's death matches the ledger, what will you do?" Her question was short and precise. He answered with a sentence that held a thin, steady resolve. "I will check the archive. If it matches, I will bring it to Professor Heller and let the facts stand." Helene's mouth pressed into a line. She did not look convinced. "Professor Heller will move like a man with papers on his desk," she said. "We'll arrange a committee, and then nothing will change." "Elias, you know how these things fold." Another shift moved through Elias from doubt into a sharpened, uneasy determination. He felt the pressure of a choice: hide the vision and protect himself, or pursue verification and risk a confrontation with powerful men. The choice drew other consequences into view. If Radek were implicated, the Count's friends would not let an antiquarian stand alone with a dangerous truth. If Elias spoke, his bookshop reputation would be irrelevant against the weight of aristocratic displeasure. The journal, meanwhile, offered a detail Elias could not ignore, an entry that placed a servant named Marta at the Radek residence one wet March evening, followed by a note in a different hand that a death certificate had been filed under a smudged name. That smudge looked deliberately made. Elias ran a fingertip across the blot of ink and felt the roughness of old glue. He flipped the page and found a pressed scrap of fabric pinned to the journal linen, faded to a dull cream with a stitch of blue that matched the sapphire's tint. The physicality of the scrap forced new questions into the room. Helene studied the fabric. "Then the journal, if Marta is the same woman who died 2 years back," she said, "and if her name is smudged, someone altered records. That is not a small thing. That is a plan to erase her." Her voice did not tremble. Instead, she listed the steps they would have to take in short sentences: check the parish death rolls, ask neighbors, find the midwife's notes. Her practical mind made a map out of possible actions, and each line of her speech shifted Elias again toward investigation. They worked until the lamplight grew thin and the windowpane blurred with early fog. Every 3 or 4 pages Elias read aloud, and Helene wrote a short note on a card. Their partnership became a rhythm, Elias reading clerk's words and Helene noting archival leads. Twice more the journal offered sharp images when Elias spoke specific names. 2 times the sapphire suggested a place and a gesture. Each vision delivered a concrete detail: a hairpin with a notch, the unique knot of a servant's scarf that could be checked in the parish records or in a surviving inventory. Partway through the night there was an unexpected knock at the heavy front door. The sound split the study's focus. Helene's hand went to the keys on her waist without speaking. "Who would be here at this hour?" Elias whispered, moving toward the door with the journal clutched under his arm. He felt the ledger of the vision press against his ribs like a confession. The knock came again, sharper. Footsteps paused on the porch. They both froze. The sound of the knock was an external event that forced immediate choice. Elias unlatched the chain and opened the door an inch. A courier stood on the step, rain beaded on his cap, and he handed Elias a thin envelope with a wax seal Elias did not recognize from the Radek residence. The courier said the Count sent word to thank you for a catalogue. "I bring this by hand." The envelope contained a formal invitation to a small exhibition on antiquities at Count Radek's salon next week, with a polite note requesting Elias' attendance. Helene's hands tightened on her apron. "They knew you bought something," she whispered, and the words landed like stones. Elias put the invitation into his inner coat pocket, feeling the fabric press against the journal. This was the surprise twist the chapter required. Not only did the vision implicate the Count, but the Count himself reached into Elias' life before the antiquarian could test the vision against records. The invitation changed how Elias would act. It offered proximity to the patron and risk in equal measure. He could refuse and proceed with slow archival checks, or he could accept and enter the Count's house where the very textiles and hairpins he had seen might still exist. They spoke in rapid, hushed lines while the rain ticked against the panis. If you go, Helene, you go armed with facts, not visions. You go with witness names. You do not mention the stone. You do not mention Clerk Elias repeated short phrases back, no mention, facts only. Take the fabric sample. Ask discreetly about Marta. Helene nodded once, decisive. The plan settled into a concrete set of steps. Before dawn, Elias wrapped the journal in oilskin and tucked the sapphire into his vest pocket wrapped in cloth. He felt the stone's grain through the fabric like a contained H. He locked the desk and left the lamp burning low. Helene put a hand on his sleeve. Elias, if you drag the Count into this, remember Marta, she said. Her fingers tightened and then let go. Remember her name. When you speak, her voice had the small insistence of someone who would keep a secret but weigh its cost. He closed the study door behind him and paused on the landing. The city was quiet except for distant carts and the occasional bark of a dog. Elias felt the weight of the evening, the vision, the journal, the invitation settle into his shoulders. He had moved through curiosity into doubt, then fear, and into a brittle resolve to check facts and to go to Radix Salon not as a seeker of spectacle, but as a man carrying evidence. He would start at the university archives and follow the trail of Marta's name. He pauses at the top stair, hand on the banister, and turns to say one last short sentence to Helene without entering a long reflection. I will go to the archive at 9, Helene. Keep the door bolted until I return. Her reply is a single word, steady and plain. Promise, he answers by touching the pocket where the sapphire sits and walking out into the dim street toward a night that carried both danger and the first small outlines of a plan. Elias pressed the blue shard to the journal's margin and the crystal flared with a cold, bright light that filled the lamp glow and threw a single exact image onto the page. A carriage overturned on the Ringstrasse, the year printed on a paper that lay half burned in the gutter. Suspicion moved through him like a practiced habit. He had bought fragments before and catalogued claims that proved false. But this image named a street he knew and a date that matched a rumor Frau Helene had once hushed in an aside. He did not step back. He kept his hand on the journal and felt his pulse count each tick of the watch in his pocket. He turned the page without hesitation, and the shard warmed under his thumb. The suspicion hardened into cold attention as Elias compared ink strokes, the curvature of a hand-drawn sigil, the same cramped script Anton Clerk used in the notes he had studied last week. He remembered unrolling the leather parcel in Chapter 1, lifting the shard that had been no bigger than a thumbpiece. And he remembered how the shard had seemed content to be an ornament until tonight. Now it projected a place and a scene that could not be dismissed as ornament. He whispered Anton, and the sound was too small in the study. The voice came out like a test. He breathed and tasted beeswax and old glue. He moved to the lamp and angled the journal beneath the glass chimney to steady the light. The shard responded with a narrow flare and a new frame. A man in a frock coat bending over a collapsed figure, a palm smudged with dark not ink, but something that dried dull like old blood. Elias' fingers tightened around the page. Footsteps paused outside the study door. Frau Helene stepped in carrying a forgotten ledger and left the door half closed behind her. She found him hunched, eyes on the page, the shard between his fingers. She did not ask what he had done. Instead, she said, Elias, are you well? You look as if you've seen a ghost. He swallowed and handed her the ledger without comment. Helene's hands were steady when she opened the ledger and traced a line with a finger. Anton Clerk, she read aloud, and then another name that made her voice catch, Weber. Elise, her lips folded at the surname, and she let the ledger fall open on the desk. Ilias, I served for a Frau Weber years ago. The children still speak of the funeral bell she named, details and address, a night watchman's complaint that tethered the vision to living people. Elias' mind shifted again. Suspicion became responsibility, then alarm. He set the journal down and rubbed his jaw. Show me, Helene, and her voice left no room for polite denial. If Anton wrote it, then read me a line. Elias read aloud the ledger entry that Helene had found. He kept the sentences short, careful to pronounce names, and Helene repeated them under her breath as if tasting poison. She folded the edge of the ledger under a thumb and looked at Elias. You cannot bring this to the magistrate without proof, she said. Names ruin houses. Elias, her hands tightened on the linen apron. Elias nodded. He could feel the old watch in his satchel like a small, steady heart. He moved to the shelf for Clerk's portrait, a trimmed engraving framed in cheap wood, and held it in the lamplight. The face in the portrait looked measured, the iron-grey hair slicked back, the mouth taut with a scholar's certainty. Elias compared the portrait's ink strokes to the handwriting in the journal. The name matched. The shard had already matched a place and a date. Elias decided to seek the municipal archives and ask Inspector Riedel to verify dates. The idea started as a practical task and quickly gathered dread around its edges. He walked the cobbled lane toward the transport wagon, ledger under his arm, thinking of the ledger's neighbor names and of Helene's slow, cautious voice. By the time he reached the municipal archives, the sun had moved low against the domes. Riedel's office smelled of glue and damp paper. Elias laid the journal flat and pointed to entries. Inspector Riedel, Elias, setting the ledger between them. This journal names a crime on the Ringstrasse. The manuscript is in Anton Clerk's hand. Will you date it and verify the names? Riedel leaned back, fingers steepled. He read, then shrugged, the lines at his mouth deepen. Ingelius, these are serious claims. Riedel, you bring accusations against respected men from a relic and a shard. The archives may confirm dates, but you must understand civic caution. His tone tried to contain alarm in paper-thin, bureaucratic restraint. Elias felt his chest harden. The emotion shifted again. Precaution warred with outrage. He repeated the address printed in the journal and named the date aloud. Riedel wrote the date on a slip and nodded. Once he will look. But do not bring slander to salons. Devils wear fine gloves here. He pushed the slip back across the table. Ayers left with the slip folded in his pocket and the ledger heavy against his ribs. Outside, the gas lamp shivered to life and the shard in his satchel hummed faintly. Back at the study, he placed the journal under the lamp and tested the shard methodically. He set the blue crystal against a pressed page with measured pressure and kept his breath even. The shard flared their first vision, Dreher. Anton Clerk in a cramped workshop, candles guttering, a brass crucible steaming, and a single violent movement, a hand breaking a bottle over a man's head. Elias saw the man's face clearly enough to note the profile and the small burn mark on his cheek. He recognized the exact manner. Clerk's brush strokes described violence in the experimental notes. The vision ended with a sigil burned into the floor. He coughed and felt a dryness in his throat. He touched his left eyebrow where the thin scar lay. And Helene, Elias, are you all right? He was not. He could still feel the warmth of the shard on his thumb. He Helene the gist in short sentences. She listened and then, without dramatics, she pressed a hand to his shoulder. Elias, Helene, if Anton wrote the method into his ledger, someone feared exposure. Names will not merely scandalize. They might avenge. Her voice dropped. She was thinking of the Weber family she had served and the quiet men in magistrate's robes. Elias watched her mouth and understood she measured consequences more by human cost than by scholarly curiosity. The emotion shifted, shock underlaid with a protective caution that came from years of keeping house and tending fragile reputations. They read the marginalia together. Helene found a folded note tucked inside the back cover. She unfolded it and read aloud a single line written in clerk's cramped hand naming a prominent magistrate as the perpetrator. The paper trembled in Helene's fingers. "This is worse than I thought," she said. Elias' voice sharpened. "You must be careful. I will return to Riedel with this here as a plan." He felt the ledger like an accusation that wanted to be hung in the city square. Helene did not protest, but she pressed a damp cloth to the lamp's chimney and watched him pack his satchel. "Take the watch. If you are stopped, give them time to read your face." Her tone left no flourish, only the steady mechanics of protection. On his way to the magistrate's townhouse, Elias encountered the magistrate's envoy in the foyer. The man stood with his hat in both hands and an expression that made Elias register the line between warning and threat. "Marwood," the envoy said, "the magistrate receives many curious claims. Some are dangerous to repeat. Think carefully where you carry gossip." The words were brief. The envoy's eyes were colder than his voice. Elias tried to measure defiance. "I have proof that names were written down, an entry in clerk's hand, and a ledger that links him to an assault." He named the victim's surname, and the envoy's face tightened. The envoy took a quick step closer and lowered his voice. "This city does not tolerate public accusation without counsel. Leave this, Marwood." The man did not strike, but the message was accurate. Elias walked away with the ledger heavier than it had been. The city's gas lamps cast pools of light, and the rain began in a distant, patient way. He thought of Riedel's caution and the envoy's quiet threat, and understood the power arrayed against an antiquarian who wished to expose a magistrate. The shard in his satchel, cool against his thigh, seemed to insist on more tests. That night the study settled into its ordinances, stacked proofs, a chair pushed close to the desk, Helene humming faintly in the adjoining kitchen. Elias set the shard in the lamp's glow and pressed it to another page. He intended a short test, and instead plunged into a long vision, an enactment that lasted as though he had been transported there. He felt the floorboards creak beneath his imagined boots, smelled the ozonic tang of crushed herbs, and watched clerk's hand move with clinical speed. The vision ended with a single violent gesture and the sigil pressed into the victim's sleeve. He staggered back, knocking papers to the floor. Helene rushed in, breath expelling a quick string of names. "Elias?" She said. "What happened?" He could not speak at first. The vision had left his palms damp and his ears ringing with the sound of broken glass. He found his voice in short bursts. "Anton, he struck him." He left a mark. The last phrase like a verdict. Helene's face tightened. "A mark on a sleeve is something a neighbor might remember. You cannot present visions. You must present proof." She spoke with that practical cadence that had kept a house intact for decades. Elias agreed and reached for the ledger to find corroboration. He opened a page and found an annotation in clerk's hand that named the magistrate explicitly and dated the deed. The discovery felt like a pivot. Riedel's caution now looked like reluctance rather than prudence. Elias resolved to deliver the note to Riedel the next morning. He sat at his desk and wrote a short note asking for a meeting, folding it with precise edges. He Helene what he planned in plain sentences. She folded her hands, looked at him, and said, "Then be quick. They will not wait for propriety if they are frightened of discovery." The words, as if they were a recipe for survival. The next afternoon Elias stood on the magistrate's doorstep and handed the folded annotation to the usher. Before the usher could retreat, a tall man in a plain coat stepped forward and fixed Elias with a look that signaled a single, private warning. The man said it would be better for all if certain pages remained closed. "Mr. Marwood," he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Elias felt the threat as a weight along his ribs. Anger flared in Elias, but it was a precise, quiet anger that dictated action rather than shouting. He left and went to a window to watch the street. He wondered who would act if the magistrate's name became public. He thought of the Weber family Helene had named and felt the responsibility as a physical pressure. He returned to the study and planned how to present the evidence without endangering innocence. That night a sound cut the study's routine. The latched window rattled. Elias moved to the desk and saw a shadow slip against the curtain. He set the lamp down with one hand and reached for the shard with the other. The room smelled of rain. The intruder moved with a gait that suggested training. The shape struck at the desk and Elias stepped between the figure and the journal. The man lunged and a struggle began. Fists, a clipped curse, the scrape of a chair across the floor. Helene called out from the doorway, "Elias," she said, and her voice contained movement. The intruder struck again and Elias felt metal at his side as the man's hand sought the satchel where the shard lay. Helene moved in and threw her shoulder into the intruder's back. The three of them grappled. Papers scattered and the lamp toppled. The shard skittered across the desktop, struck the journal's spine, and split with a sharp, crystalline sound that seemed to slice the air. For a moment the shard's pieces shone with a dozen small visions, each too quick to hold, and then one image resolved long enough to seize Elias. A face he trusted, an acquaintance who had accompanied him to auctions, standing over a body, a sigil visible on the sleeve. Elias had never suspected this man in the way the image presented him. The revelation landed like a hard step. Elias froze with one hand on the splintered crystal. His breath came in short, clean pulls. The intruder broke away and fled into the rain. Helene pressed the damp cloth to Elias' split knuckle and hissed at his stillness. "Who was that?" she demanded. Elias could barely form the name. He it aloud because he had Tamathis Hala. He managed, helped me catalogue proofs last winter. He was with me at the auction. The name sounded like a crack in the quiet. Helene's eyes widened. She had seen Mathis at the market, at ease and polite and entirely unremarkable. The emotion shifted again, shock warping into a brittle, searching suspicion that rearranged Elias' memory of small favors and quiet confidences. Dawnlight thinned across the study and Elias sat with Helene at his small kitchen table while she tended his cuts. The shard lay in fragments on the desk, glitter in the lamplight like a wasted coin. Elias' hands trembled and he forced himself to count the ledger's pages once more, then placed a clean sheet atop the open journal to cover what remained visible. He heard the distant clatter of an early cart and then a knock, sharp, deliberate, on the outer door. Helene stood and smoothed her aproni. "Will answer, Elias. Stay here and keep the journal closed." She left him with that instruction and the warmth of her hand on his shoulder. Elias watched her go and felt the last emotion of the night settle itself, a quiet resolve edged with dread. He realized that whatever proof Riedel might find, the journal and the shard had already changed who he trusted. The knock came again, harder this time. Helene's voice carried back, "Clipped Inspector Riedel." Elias heard her say. He rose and moved to the door with a limp and saw Riedel's figure silhouetted in the hallway. He had a slip of paper in his hand and his face was taut. Riedel crossed the threshold, placed the slip on the table, and said, "Mayor Marwood, this city begins to move when accusations name its pillars. You will need evidence they cannot dismiss. Tell me everything." Now Elias sank into a chair and began to speak in plain, even sentences. The shard's flare, Helene's ledger, clerk's marginalia, Mathis Hala's visage in the vision. He spoke until his voice thinned and the morning light warmed the desk where fragments of blue lay like a broken promise. Outside the study, the city continued, carts, a distant bell, a horse stamping. Inside, decisions stacked themselves in Elias' chest. He had to choose whether to present partial proof and risk ruin for the innocent, or to bury the discovery and guard small lives from the sweep of public scandal. The shard's fire had described a crime and created a list of names. The calendar on his mind now read, expose, protect, or wait. The knock that had opened the final conversation repeated, softer. Riedel's pen tapped once on the ledger as Elias looked at Helene, and then at the fragments on the desk. The blue shard flared against the ledger, and light carved a single frozen image across the workbench. A carriage on its side on the Ringstrasse, and a man on the cobbles holding a burned paper. Suspicion tightened Elias Marwood's jaw the instant the image resolved. He touched the shard and watched the scene, as if the crystal held a photograph of guilt. He had come to Clerk's laboratory to look for notes, not to see a crime. The shard made the crime visible. That concrete fact became the problem he could not ignore. Elias stood over Anton Clerk's central bench with the shard cupped between thumb and forefinger. He smelled metal polish, old oil, and the faint chemical tang Anton had recorded in his journal. He remembered the parcel he had opened 2 nights earlier, remembered the tiny blue fragment tucked between water-stained pages. He remembered the overturned carriage that had appeared in the shard's light the first time he pressed it to a margin. He forced his hands to be steady. He moved the shard away and the image snapped off. The bench returned to its scattered state: ink bottles, a cracked brass magnifier, a brittle scrap of paper pinned with a rusted tack. He set the shard beside a lamp and leaned in, reading Clerk's handwriting. His eyes scanned a list of names. One name followed by an address on the Ringstrasse, waited there with a penciled annotation arranged. The notation read as deliberate record-keeping. Elias's suspicion shifted to apprehension. His throat felt tight as he read the single word. Noise at the outer door made him look up. He moved through the lab toward the threshold and found Frau Helene Bauer standing in the doorway, her apron dark with the housework she had left to find him. Helene's mouth set when she saw his face. She came forward and took the lamp from the bench. Her hands were steady. "Elias, Helene, you look as if you saw a corpse." "Not a corpse," Elias answered. "A scene, a carriage, a magistrate's name." Helene folded the lamp into her arm. "Show me." He handed her the shard. Helene turned it in her palm under the lamp and frowned. "It burns cold," she said, and the sentence was both observation and warning. Her voice stayed even, but her fingers tightened on the shard. She kept her eyes on Elias. Elias felt another shift inside him. Suspicion became fear when Helene's steady gaze met his. He knew Helene well enough to read the small changes in her posture. She set the shard on the table, then moved a pile of papers so she could work at his side. They searched the bench with speed and care. Elias pried at a warped board beneath the bench. Helene pressed a shoulder to a loose plank until it yielded, and between the joists their fingers found leather. They drew up a ledger bound in dark, cracked leather and a folded map, edges moth-eaten and annotated in Clerk's careful hand. Elias opened the ledger on his knee while Helene smoothed the map on the bench. The ledger's entries were dated and precise locations, times, abbreviated notes in German names that matched the list Elias had read. "Alias, look at this, Helene." She pointed at an entry and read slowly: Ringstrasse property, payment received, witnessed by a clerk. Elias traced the ink with a fingertip. He felt the grain of the paper through his nail. The shard had shown him a carriage and a burned scrap. The ledger gave him a name, a place, a transaction. The evidence stacked itself into a pattern. His hands went cold. They had external proof now, not only the shard's sudden images. The ledger and the map turned suspicion into a traceable path. Elias reached for his pocket watch and checked the time by habit. It made a small, private sound. We must copy this." He did not let the sentence become a question. Helene's reply was immediate. "I will get paper." "Elias, copy what you can." "We cannot hold the whole book." She moved to fetch paper and ink while Elias ran his finger along the ledger's margin. He found a notation he had not noticed before, a date that matched the year printed on the burned page had seen in the shard vision. He read the date aloud. "June 19th, he said. Helene returned with a pad and a stub of pencil. She set them down and stood close enough for their sleeves to brush. "If someone still watches this place," she said, "we do not want them to think we took anything." Elias nodded. He began to copy entries, his hand quick and measured. He read aloud short lines as he copied them so Helene could confirm names. Their voices struck the room with ordinary sounds. The pencil on paper, Helene's short breath, the lamp's quiet glow. The ledger vision arrived while Elias worked. He placed the shard on an open page, and the shard flared cold light across the paper. This time the image unfolded as if a hidden page had opened in front of them. Da-da. Anton Clerk stood in the background, shoulders squared, eyes downcast, while a high magistrate in a dark frock coat spoke in low tones and pointed to a ledger entry. The magistrate's fingers tapped the page. A folded paper passed between them. Clerk's jaw tightened in the image. He did not move to stop the magistrate. Elias felt his breath shorten. The shard rendered the act with detail, the magistrate's cufflink, the smudge of ash on a sleeve, the exact curve of the ledger's spine. The vision made evidence of a cover-up. Elias's fear hardened into a decision. He closed his hand around the pencil and continued to copy. His voice stayed steady when he read the magistrate's name aloud. They worked without long pause. Helene kept watch at the door while Elias copied. The lab's silence felt like a room holding its breath. Footsteps creaked on the corridor outside. Helene motioned him to stop writing, and she went to the threshold. A man's shape filled the doorway. He moved like someone who had been taught to stand without giving away nervousness. He wore a well-cut coat and carried a small leather portfolio. His hat sat low. He looked like a messenger from a comfortable household. "Good evening," the man said. His voice was polite and quick. "I bring a request." Helene put a hand on the ledger as if steadying it. "This is private," she said. "You cannot just walk in." "My name is Groff," the man said. "Matthias Groff. I am the caretaker." Helene glanced back at Elias. "Matthias," she said, "you should not be here at this hour. Then perhaps you should not be here either." Matthias the sentence without anger. It contained warning and the memory of duty. He closed the door behind him and kept his hat in his hands. Elias stood and put the pencil down. "Matthias," he said, "we are only looking through what Clerk left behind." Matthias's jaw worked. "Visitors were discreet in Clerk's time," he said. "They did not have curious fingers in ledger spines." Helene's reply came hard and quick. "And who appointed you judge of curiosity, Matthias?" "Elias has every right." Matthias looked between them and his eyes slid to the ledger and the shard. He inhaled as if tasting information. "You would do well to leave what you find alone," he said. "Not everything discovered brings relief." Elias felt the tension rise. He became more certain that someone watched Clerk's papers. He also felt another internal shift. The suspicion that had guided his first moves now moved into anger. The anger made his hands steady again. He stepped closer to Matthias. "Matthias, Elias, did you see visitors in Clerk's lab? Did you ever witness a magistrate's name in these papers?" Matthias's lips tightened. "There were men who paid to keep things quiet," he said. "I saw payments. I saw faces that did not belong here." Helene made a sound at the back of her throat. "Elias," she said, "we cannot let them keep this quiet." Matthias set his hat on the bench with a careful motion. "You do not know who you anger," he warned. "You do not understand how swiftly a word can ruin a man." Elias's next move was to place trust in proof. He pushed the ledger toward Matthias. "Read," he said. "Read and tell me what you saw." Matthias thumbed the pages and his face changed in small increments: curiosity, concern, then a hard, quick swallow. He pointed to an entry and read the names aloud in a flat voice. "Ringstrasse property, payment received, a clerk witness. You remember this, Elias?" Matthias met his eyes. "I took the money to the man's wife once," he said. "I took it because I had no choice. I spread the rumor that Anton kept bad company." Helene's voice came low. "You spread a rumor?" Matthias's answer was a single motion. He looked away. "We all tried to keep peace," he said. Elias felt clarity settle in his hands the way ink settled into paper. The ledger backed the shard's vision. A magistrate had used Clerk's records to arrange something on the Ringstrasse. Whether the arrangement had led to an accident or a frame, the evidence now showed a link. Elias folded the copied pages and tucked them inside his coat. He met Helene's eyes and found the same resolve there. They would not bury this. Footsteps sounded again in the corridor, harder this time. Helene pressed her hand to her mouth and then to the door. A knock followed 3 slow, deliberate raps that belonged to men who expected obedience, not interruption. Elias set the copied pages down like a stake. "Do not open," he told Helene. He moved toward the doorway and set the shard in the pocket of his waistcoat. He felt the pocket press cold against his palm. The man who answered the knock wore a dark coat of finer cloth than Matthias's. He brought no hat into the room. His eyes were small and quick. His lips moved with practiced civility. "Good night," the man said. "I represent Her Magistrate. We would take that ledger and the small blue stone. There is no need for trouble." Helene placed a hand on Elias's sleeve and said his name in a way that asked him to think. Elias turned to her and then to the envoy. The envoy's posture suggested he expected compliance. Elias shook his head. "You will not take it," he said. The envoy's smile thinned. "Herr Marwood, you mistake your position. You do not hold power here. Return the items and a quiet arrangement can be made." Helene answered for them both. "We will not hand anything over to men who speak for shadowed interests." The envoy's voice dropped a degree. "You are acting with courage, Frau Bauer. Courage has consequences." Matthias stepped forward. "You do not threaten her," he said. The envoy turned his face to Matthias. "I do not threaten," he said. "I advise the magistrate has friends in the right rooms. He does not wish scandal. Consider your position." The confrontation tightened like a vice. Helene and Elias stood together. Elias felt fear again, sharper, nearer. It came as a physical reaction. His fingers curled, his jaw set, his breath measured. He thought of the ledger, the shard, the portrait of Anton Clerk with ink on his hands. He thought of the carriage on the cobbles. He thought of the magistrate's cufflink. Elias folded the copied pages into a small packet and slid them into Helene's arms. "Take these now," he said. "Hide them at home until we decide what to do." Helene frowned. "Elias, you cannot take them," Elias insisted. "Now!" She closed her fingers around the papers. Her face was set. "Give me the ledger too," she said. Elias hesitated for only a breath. He set the ledger on a shelf and pushed it toward a dark alcove where it could not be seen at first glance. He then moved the shard to a different hiding place under a pile of oilcloths. The envoy's eyes watched every motion. "You will hand them over," the envoy said, "or I will return with men who will ensure compliance." Matthias laughed once, without humor. "Men who ensure compliance have never liked laboratories," he said. "They prefer other rooms for their work." The envoy's face tightened. He turned his portfolio as if to signal more than talk. "This is not a negotiation," he said. "Return the items or accept the consequences." Helene stepped in front of Elias. "Do it another way," she said. "Do you want us to hand everything to you because you threaten?" The envoy paused and then lowered his voice. "I offer you protection if you cooperate." Elias heard the proposal as if it were an object laid on the bench beside the ledger. He weighed it. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "We will not be bought." The envoy's eyes narrowed and he left the lab with a curt bow, the hint of a promise in his gait. The door shut behind him with a small, decisive sound. For a moment, all 3 of them stood in the quiet of a room that had grown thinner with risk. Helene opened her hand and the copied pages lay flat like a small map of accusation. She set them carefully into her apron pocket. Matthias folded his hat into his hands and said, "You have made an enemy." Elias answered with action instead of rhetoric. He went to the ledger and made a quick transcription of the most damning entries. He marked the map with notes that matched the ledger's addresses. Helene assisted, murmuring names as he wrote. Matthias watched and then, to their surprise, helped move the ledger and made a deliberate point of closing a shutter to dim the lab's exposure. The unexpected twist altered Elias's impression of Matthias. Where he had first assumed the caretaker to be a silent protector of secrets, he now saw a man who had once participated in quiet compromises and was trying, in his own way, to face the consequence of those choices. The ledger that had condemned a magistrate also implicated people who had accepted payment and kept their mouths shut. Elias felt the ledger's weight as both proof and responsibility. Helene folded the copied pages and tucked them beneath her apron. "Elias," she said quietly, "we do not have much time." They left the laboratory in different directions. Elias walked past the dark windows of the workshop and stepped out into the wet side street. His coat collar smelled of oil and lamp smoke. He kept his hand in his pocket on the shard, feeling the cold stone press into his palm. He had moved from suspicion to fear to resolve within the span of an hour, and the last change left him with a steady purpose. At home, Elias sat at his desk before dawn with the copied pages spread like evidence. He refolded a corner and checked each name against the ledger in his memory. He compared dates. He underlined entries with a pencil so the most incriminating items showed at a glance. The physical action of underlining made the decisions concrete. The quiet work steadied him. Helene came in with a tray of tea and placed it on his desk. She set the cup down without a word and sat opposite him. Elias looked up and saw the small mole near her temple, and the way her hands folded when she listened. He felt gratitude, then a worry that came as a pressure in his chest. "You did well, Helene." "You kept watch," Elias replied. "You risked more than I did." She shook her head. "We both did. We also made a choice. Matthias helped. That means someone else may come to our door, Elias." Elias folded the copied pages and slid them into the lining of his satchel. He checked the pocket with the shard. It rested there cold and inert. He set the antique pocket watch face down on the desk and listened to its tick as if it measured not time but decision. There was a soft knock at his front door, then 2 firm taps that exactly matched the rhythm of the earlier knock at the laboratory. Elias froze. Helene's fingers found his sleeve, and the lamp's flame steadied. Elias moved to the door and opened it a fraction. On the threshold lay a folded scrap of paper, pushed through with a quietness that meant the sender wished no conversation. There was no messenger in sight. Elias picked up the scrap and unfolded it. The note contained a single line in a neat hand: "We prefer silence. Be careful." Elias read it twice. The words were not a threat as much as a statement of fact. Someone intended to keep control. The shard's images, the ledger's ink, the envoy's visits all converged into a clear danger. He put the scrap into his pocket and closed the door slowly. Helene watched him with an expression that mixed worry and resolve. Elias placed the copied pages inside a small locked drawer and then closed the drawer with deliberate care. He touched the side of his face where the thin scar lay above his left eyebrow. Memory of Anton Clerk's ink-stained fingertips came back in a precise flash, the small burn on the alchemist's cheek as shown in a portrait. The brass magnifier tucked in Clerk's satchel. Elias folded both hands and let the weight of the night settle into action. By dawn, Elias had decided he would not yield to threats. He would not hand the ledger to men who spoke for a magistrate. He would not hide behind inaction. He recognized now that the shard did not merely reveal scenes. It assigned consequence. He understood that revealing the truth would bring danger, but hiding it would sustain injustice. The night ended in small, practical resolutions. Helene would hide the copied pages in a place known only to her and a widow who ran a bakery. Matthias would give a corroborating statement if needed, and would supply a small ledger of his own, a list of payments he had once delivered. Elias would visit the Ringstrasse property in daylight to confirm addresses and names without alarming anyone. As Elias prepared to leave the house at dawn, he paused by the lamp and looked at the small brass key on his desk, the key that opened the drawer where he had first found the shard's parcel. He slipped the key into his waistcoat pocket and then felt, in the pocket beneath it, the shard lying cool and patient. The concrete tools of decision sat together, a key, a shard, copied pages. He closed his coat and set the satchel over his shoulder. Helene stood beside the door and touched his sleeve. "Elias," she said, "be careful." He looked at her and nodded. The fear he had carried all night had become a careful determination, enacted in small steps. He opened the door and stepped into the pale dawn, moving toward the next piece of evidence on the map. Behind him, the house kept its quiet. In his pocket, a scrap of paper warned of silence, and on his bench the ledger sat half hidden and waiting. A carriage rolled by on the street as he closed the door. Elias watched it pass, and remembered the shard's image of one that had not risen again. He set his shoulders and walked toward the Ringstrasse address with his head bent, his stride measured. The chapter's immediate conflict, the ledger, the shard, the envoy's demand, had been resolved for the night into careful plans and scattered hiding places. But the larger danger had only sharpened. He kept his hand on his satchel as if he might discover new proof there at any step. A sharp knock struck Elias Marwood's balcony door while he bent over the railing, rain running in thin rivers from his coat. Inspector Wace pushed a folded, scorched fragment of paper across the sill with an outstretched hand. Suspicion tightened Elias' jaw in the same instant the shard in his pocket pressed cold against his palmelius. Wace, voice low, this came from the Ringstrasse archive. We found suit on the edge. Elias took the fragment with fingers that trembled slightly and laid the blue shard across the burned edge. The crystal flared, producing a single, hard image, a carriage overturned, a crest stamped in gilt, and a hand holding a singed paper. The problem was sudden and plain. Someone of rank had been implicated in a deliberate act tied to the old wreck. Elias knew, then, that his curiosity would demand a choice. Rain hit the balcony floor in staccato taps. Elias wiped his hands on his waistcoat and let Helene close the door behind Inspector Wace. He held the scrap under the study lamp and watched the way the shard threw the carriage's wheel into crisp relief on the paper. The sensation in his chest was not poetic. It was the practical ache of responsibility. He remembered the ledger image from the journal, the carriage on its side, and a man gripping a burned paper, and the repeated detail made him clamp his mouth shut. This suspicion moved him to action. He could not ignore the shard's accusation. Wace, Elias' voice steadying, "What do you want me to do now?" He set the scrap beside Anton's ledger and felt Helene's fingers at his elbow. She kept a hand near the satchel that carried the journal. Helene's presence was small but deliberate. She moved through the study to the bookcase and checked the lock's teeth with a practiced touch. "Elias," she said, "if you wish to show this, you must be certain first. People will look to us now." Her words were not fear alone. They were care for the household. Elias heard the two meanings and let both influence him. Inspector Wace leaned closer to the spread pages. "That crest belongs to Count Mathieson," he said. His tone carried the weight of municipal procedures rather than moral outrage. He folded the fragment and tapped the suit along the edge. "If the shard confirms more, we will need public notice. The archive won't reach for this on hearsay." Elias thought of the carriage on the Ringstrasse and felt a second motion under the suspicion. Doubt slid into him as he considered possible distortions in the shard's projection. He forced the shard to show more. Helene peered at the ledger while Elias traced the margin with the crystal. The light sharpened until it produced a second scene inside the lamp's cone, a crest in relief, a servant's silhouette stepping backward with a hand at his throat. Helene inhaled audibly. "The figure's sleeve," she said, then stopped. "Pd know that cut. I mended a tear like that once in the Mathieson household." The recognition dropped through the room like a stone. Doubt folded into something else, fear for those still connected to the household. Helene's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. They argued in short, precise sentences about preservation and disclosure. "If we expose the Count, Elias, we bring ruin to the servant and anyone who served him." "Elias, keeping this buried protects the guilty," Helene answered, voice low but firm. "You know Anton meant the artefact to find culpability, not to bury it." Elias felt the shard grow heavier by temperament. The two of them moved toward a shared plan: consult Dre Anton Clerk's ritual so the shard might reveal sequence rather than a single frozen accusation. The decision was practical, not moralizing. They would follow Anton's method. Elias pulled Anton's journal from the satchel and opened to the page where handwriting slanted like small steps. The ritual required tracing ink across a ledger page while the shard lay on the traced ink. Anton's notes specified motions of the hand, breath counts, and a precise order of candles. Elias read the steps aloud while Helene arranged the candles. He felt a shift from suspicion to focused resolve. His hands steadied as he set the ledger on the table and arranged the shard. The ritual needed concentration and the right posture. He inclined his body over the book as he had done years cataloguing proofs for other men's reputations. In the few minutes before the ritual, they spoke in clipped exchanges about consequence. Helene, Elias, if this names the Count, what then? Helene paused, then touched his forearm. You do not aim to destroy where the innocent may suffer. We aim to bring the deed to the right room for judgment. The line between justice and damage hung between them like a rule to measure by. Elias nodded. He struck a match, and the candle flame took. Elias followed Anton's hand motions exactly. He traced the ledger marks with a fingertip and let the shard rest on the page. The crystal's light bubbled into the ink and then contracted, forming an image that was not a single frozen tableau, but a brief moving sequence. Elias watched action, a hand lifting a whip, the Count leaning forward, the servant pushed beneath a folding carriage step. The shard supplied a second, new detail. Someone else at the carriage stood behind the Count, placing a folded paper into the servant's clenched hand. The revelation arrived as a cut of behavior, not a mood, and it changed what they understood. Elias' body reacted. His jaw set and his hand trembled once. Anton spoke then, not aloud but in a pressure of presence that made Elias' neck prickle. His voice in the vision had the rasp of lab air and the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The reproach was specific, a marked hesitation in the Count's movement, and a second deliberate act that arranged the torn paper, so the servant bore visible guilt. Elias flinched and involuntary questions opened. The shard had shown manipulation. Helene made no attempt to hide her shock. She stepped backward and pressed a palm to her mouth. The fear that had hovered took on a sharper edge, fear not of scandal, but of a framed man and the ripple of ruined livelihoods. A hard knock sounded at the front hall. Helene's hand went at once to her keys. Elias lifted his head. A messenger stood at the threshold, cloak wet, eyes assessing. He handed a sealed envelope to Helene without a word and left. The envelope was embossed with the Count's crest. Inside was a thin note, an offer of money, and an implied threat. "You can settle this quietly," the note read in stiff script. Elias felt the crystalline thread of the whole case tighten. He showed the note to Weisty would buy silence. Weisty will move fast if you delay. Elias looked at Helene. Her face had changed from servant's concern to a personal reckoning. The old household shed served had reasons to fear. She admitted, voice small, that she had once mended the Count's hem, and that she knew the servant in the shard's vision by the bend of his shoulder. Her memory made the accusation concrete. They argued in the hall under the flicker of gaslight. "Helene, you must tell me everything you remember about that household," Elias demanded. "Helene, who was that servant?" Inspector Wace shifted his weight and used questions like tools. Helene answered in direct sentences and let names fall from her mouth. Barthel, a footman. Greta, the lady who left after the carriage incident. Each name altered the map of culpability. Elias took notes quickly. The shard had shown the Count in a planted paper, but it had not answered motive. Elias needed motive to persuade the ledger room's officials. Helene suggested they take the shard and Anton's corroborating pages to the municipal ledger room at dawn. Elias agreed. They prepared for the public demonstration that would be the chapter's risk and the city's judgment. Elias wrapped the journal in oilcloth. He hid the shard inside the hollow of an old ink bottle, so its light could be produced at the other room. Helene packed a small bundle with a linen handkerchief and the keys she always carried. Weiss pledged to bring a witness from the archive and to arrange for the ledger room to be opened at first light. The tension shifted then from private fear to procedural urgency. Elias felt resolve again. Doubt had been supplanted by a clear outward action. Bring the evidence where law recorded fact. Dawn arrived thick and cold. They walked quickly to the municipal building with the shard in Elias' coat and the journal beneath his arm. Helene kept step beside him. Weiss led, face set, and the messenger's rhetoric from the previous night buzzed like distant flies. At the ledger room, clerks looked up and then away, accustomed to odd requests. Weiss produced his credentials, and the small crowd was admitted. Elias laid the ledger on the broad table, opened Anton's pages, and set the shard upon the inked reproduction that Anton had prepared for such display. Elias placed the shard and, with his thumb, followed the ritual's motion. Helene stood close, her knuckles white against the linen bundle. Weiss had arranged a municipal clerk as a recorder. A thin woman with a ledger sat to take down events. The shard flared, and this time the sequence resolved fully across the ledger's surface. The shard showed the Count putting an instruction into an aide's hand, sliding a folded piece into the servant's palm, and then the carriage collapsing by a harness cut deliberately made. The recording clerk glanced up and swallowed. The crowd in the room stiffened. The envoy arrived late and red-faced, the noble's colors muted beneath the gaslight. The envoy stepped forward with 3 men behind him. He tried to intercept the table and laid a hand on the ledger. You cannot use that in a public forum. He said Count Mathieson offers restitution. In private, his words were a mixture of official calm and a thin threat. Inspector Weiss answered with municipal formality, "Will record this before any private dealings." The envoy's face hardened. He reached for the shard. Elias moved his hand over the crystal and said, "Do not touch that." The room contracted to the distance between hands. The envoy's hand stopped. A quick scramble followed. One of the envoy's men tried to seize the ledger from the table. Weiss barked, and 2 record officers rose to intercept. Helene stepped forward then and placed herself by Elias' shoulder in a deliberate, protective motion. A clerk ran to fetch the municipal seal. In 3 short exchanges the envoy demanded silence and Elias refused. The dialogue was clipped, 6 lines pressed into the span of seconds. "You cannot touch it. Elias, you will not remove evidence." Weiss replied, "The Count will not be shamed in public. The envoy Snapaid will answer where law commands." Weiss countered. "Helene, Barthel's life matters, as does Greta's." The envoy lunged. An officer moved faster and pressed the envoy back. At the moment of physical collision, the shard flared brighter, and the ledger showed one final motion, a hand, not the Count's, closing the carriage's brake, so the fall became a catastrophe rather than an accident. The shard revealed an intentional escalation. Someone had arranged the harness to fail. That detail changed the legal tone from negligence to a deliberate act. The envoy's face betrayed shock. The municipal clerk stood, breath shallow, then nodded to Weiss. The record would be taken, and the shard's sequence appended. Elias felt adrenaline and exhaustion overlap. He handed the ledger and Anton's copied pages to Weiss and watched as the clerk sealed them for official custody. Outside the ledger room, rain had left the cobbles shining. People moved in small groups like a current around a rock. Elias stood with Helene and Weiss while the municipal officers debated next steps. The noble's immediate reach snapped back. The envoy's threat had lost its edge in the face of recorded projection and the clerk's seal. An arrest would not be immediate. The letter writing and marriages of alliance required paperwork, but social protections that had shielded the Count began to fray. Elias felt his shoulders uncrumple. The tension eased into cautious relief. He also felt fatigue and a quiet ache where his hands had clenched. Helene took charge of small reprisals. She spoke with 2 municipal clerks about protecting Barthel from sudden dismissal, about issuing quiet notices to households who sheltered servants. She moved with practical precision, bartering for safe passages and temporary lodgings. Elias watched her and felt a new appreciation for how she kept the household's dignity afloat. Weiss catalogued the ledger and took statements. He thanked Elias and said plainly, You did the right thing. Marwood Elias accepted the gratitude without exultation. The legal machinery had begun, but consequences would be slow and uneven. Back at the study, Elias removed Anton's shard and placed it upon the small oilcloth. He traced his finger once over the journal's margin and then, after a pause, opened a small plate into which he etched a rubbing of the ritual's image and ink impression Anton had taught him to record. The rubbing would be a copy for the archive. He copied the ritual steps into a new codex and placed the duplicate pages with the ledger he would deposit in the municipal safe. He then returned the original shard to Anton's journal and slid the book back into the satchel. Helene set a cup of tea before him and sat opposite with the keys on the table. She spoke with a measured cadence. Elias, you have given some people a chance they might not have had. Barthel may yet be questioned fairly. She paused and then added, but some families will lose more than comfort. They may lose position and bread. Elias put his hands around the cup and let the heat steady him. He did not speak long apologies. He described facts. The ledger had been sealed. Weiss had the copy. Helene had secured temporary lodging for the footman. They discussed practical steps, not moral abstractions. Helene's voice remained plain and resolute. She would see to the household's immediate safety. They moved through the wreckage of the night's events in a series of small acts. Elias wrote a statement for Inspector Weiss with short, exact sentences describing what he had seen, what the shard had shown, and the steps he had taken. Helene catalogued textiles and receipts that might show the Count's influence on servants' employment. She placed keys for a small chest in Elias' hand and said, "Keep these until the inquiry asks." The list of tasks tightened the day into manageable pieces. Elias felt a calm he would not call relief. He felt the quiet of necessary work. Weeks followed that were like slow weather. The municipal inquiry unfolded in formal reports. The Count's influence frayed in social circles where people who had once bent to him now measured their risk. Barthel was taken in for questioning under municipal supervision, and Greta, when located, provided a short, factual account of the carriage's happenings and the Count's actions. The shard's record had shifted how authorities asked questions. Elias visited the municipal rooms, gave measured testimony, and kept Anton's ritual copies in the municipal safe as requested. He learned then that justice moved along many rails: legal, social, and private, and that its progress could be uneven. At home, Helene dealt with small reprisals that were not public, solicitors who came asking discreet favors on behalf of embittered families, a tradesman who refused to deliver certain parcels. She negotiated quietly and, when required, hardened her voice. Elias observed, and when he had to act he did so with the ledger's copy in his hand. He judged for decisions that would spare the vulnerable where possible. Once, when a stern letter arrived demanding the return of a bound volume, Elias refused. He delivered a short note to the municipal clerk instead and let the city's agents answer. The final movement of the chapter lay in how Elias chose to preserve and to reveal. He did not release every detail Anton had recorded. He made a copy of the ritual image for the municipal archive, but left some marginal notes in Anton's journal intact and wrapped the shard back into the oilcloth. He had argued with Weiss over some lines. Elias wanted the public to know the essential facts that pointed to a deliberate action, and Weiss insisted on restraint where the evidence would do more harm than good. They compromised. The municipal record held the sequence that implicated the Count. The private notes about motives and secondary players were sealed and marked for later review, only if further evidence demanded release. Helene helped Elias shelve Anton's journal under a curtain of dust in a lower, locked shelf. "We will come back to this when things settle," she said. Her tone was neither resignation nor optimism. It was the voice of someone who would keep a house intact. Elias set the satchel down and straightened the room's slow angles. He ran a finger along the spine of an ordinary ledger and then closed the study door behind them. The chapter ended not with a flourish but with a deliberate, concrete action. Helene turned the key in the lock and set it onto the desk, where Elias could take it in the morning. By the time morning filled the panes with pale light, the immediate legal danger had passed, though the undercurrent of consequence remained. Elias stood at his desk and wrote a short inventory of the items he had given to the municipal safe. He listed Anton's ritual copy first, then the rubbing, then the ledger pages. His hands moved cleanly. Helene folded an embroidered handkerchief and placed it into a parcel destined for Barthel. She labeled it with the footman's name and the address of a small boarding house where he could remain under municipal care. Elias watched her and, in that watching, understood how their choices had reshaped lives in ways that would be measured over months. At noon, Inspector Weiss returned the municipal receipt and nodded to Elias with something like respect that was not sentimental. "We'll take it from here, Marwood." He said, "We will proceed within the law." Elias handed him the copied dossier and watched the inspector's broad shoulders move away. He felt his role shift again, no longer the man who forced a public demonstration, but the keeper of a copy. The person who would remain to guard the journal and help those who needed discreet aid. A week later, Helene came to Elias with a small report. Barthel had shelter. Greta had been advised to name other witnesses if she wished. And the Count's immediate social circle had begun to avoid public association. Helene's hands were steady as she read. Elias marked the report in his own hand and slid it into a folder. He thought of Anton's voice in the ritual, his reproach, his authority not as a ghost to command, but as a tool that had compelled truth. Elias did not gloat. He felt responsibility as a set of choices to be made and remade. The shard stayed locked in Anton's journal. Elias had left one copy with the municipal archives and had the rubbing in his own ledger. He continued to catalogue items for clients and to walk the same streets that had once meant only business. People nodded in passing but said little. The night's strain left a line of grey at the temple of his hair. He tightened his coat and kept working. Helene visited households to ensure that temporary protections were observed. They moved in practical steps that required no ceremony. When night came, Elias took the journal from the shelf and set it on his desk. He traced the blue edge of the shard through the oilcloth like a final measure, and then closed the cover. He placed the keys Helene had left on top of the book and looked at them as objects that arranged life. His choice had been to reveal enough to move law, to protect the vulnerable when possible, and to keep some margins sealed to spare those whose lives would be unraveled by full disclosure. It was an imperfect justice carried out by hand and record rather than by speech. Helene rose then, smoothing her apron, and said simply, "I will see Barthel to the lodging in the morning." Elias nodded and felt the day settle into order. The lock clicked. They both heard it and, without fanfare, resumed the tidy motions of the household. The work of accountability would continue, but for now their immediate task was done. Helene took the teacup, wrapped it in linen for Barthel, and left the study with the parcel in her hands. Outside the rain had stopped, and the Ringstrasse lay clean and indifferent. Elias watched a carriage pass and felt a measured exhaustion that signaled completion rather than triumph. He recorded a short note to the municipal clerk and put it in the post. Then, with Helene's small bundle on the desk and Anton's journal locked away, he drew the curtains and moved to his chair. The final concrete act was small and human. Helene closed the study's outer door and slid the brass latch into place, leaving Elias alone with his ledger and the quiet tasks of tomorrow.